The bitter taste of betrayal was still fresh on Sarah Parker's lips as she stood shivering on the auction block in Dry Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1876. 6 months a widow and now being sold to the highest bidder like cattle, all because her husband's gambling debts had left her with nothing but creditors pounding at her door. $500 for the widow Parker. Do I hear $550? The auctioneer bellowed, his voice carrying across the dusty main street where townsfolk had gathered for the spectacle. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to acknowledge the hungry stares of men bidding on her domestic services or worse. Thomas Parker had been a loving husband but a terrible gambler. His final promise before consumption took him had been whispered through blood-flecked lips. "I'll make sure you're taken care of, my love." How hollow those words rang now as the auctioneer's gavel prepared to seal her fate. $700, called a gravelly voice from the back of the crowd. The crowd parted as Victor Daniels stepped forward, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. His weathered face betrayed nothing beneath the brim of his Stetson, but his eyes sharp and clear as spring water locked with Sarah's. 700 going once, twice. Sold to Mr. Daniels. The auctioneer handed Victor a bill of sale as Sarah was ushered off the platform. Her legs trembled beneath her faded calico dress as she approached her new owner. "Mrs. Parker," Victor said with a curt nod, his voice softer now. "My ranch is half a day's ride north. Can you ride?" "I can," she answered, summoning what dignity remained. Victor glanced around at the dispersing crowd, then leaned closer. "I knew your husband." Sarah stiffened. "If you've come to collect on another debt—" "No, madam. Thomas saved my life once during a cattle drive. Before he passed, he wrote me, asked me to look out for you if things went poorly." He shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't know how poorly until I rode into town today." "You knew my husband?" Sarah repeated, disbelieving. Victor nodded. "I'll be the man he wanted you to have looking after you, Mrs. Parker." Nothing more expected. Sarah studied him, this tall stranger with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands. Something in his direct gaze spoke of honesty, but she'd learned the hard way that men's promises could be as fleeting as morning dew. "I have your word on that, Mr. Daniels?" "You do." He handed her the reins to a chestnut mare. "And it's Victor." The journey to Victor's ranch was spent largely in silence. Sarah lost in thoughts of how quickly her life had unraveled. Just 2 years ago, she and Thomas had arrived in Wyoming with dreams of prosperity. Now at 26, she was property, sold to a stranger, albeit one who claimed to have known her husband. As the sun began to set, they crested a hill revealing a modest but well-maintained ranch nestled in a valley. A 2-story home stood surrounded by corrals, a barn, and several outbuildings. Cattle dotted the distant pastures. "Welcome to Broken Arrow Ranch," Victor said, breaking the silence. "It's larger than I expected," Sarah admitted. "Been building it up for 8 years now. Started with just 10 head of cattle and that barn." He nodded toward a weathered structure. The house came later. As they approached, a middle-aged woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. "Martha," Victor called out. "This is Mrs. Sarah Parker. She'll be staying with us." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly, but she offered a warm smile. "Welcome, Mrs. Parker. I've prepared the guest room upstairs." "Martha's our housekeeper," Victor explained. "Been here 5 years. She'll show you around." Relief washed over Sarah. The presence of another woman eased her immediate fears about Victor's intentions. The food was simple but plentiful, a stark contrast to the meager meals she'd been surviving on since Thomas's death. "You'll need to rest," Victor said as they finished. "Tomorrow I can show you the ranch, and we can discuss your duties." "My duties?" Sarah asked cautiously. Victor's expression remained neutral. Martha handles most of the cooking and cleaning, but there's plenty of other work. Garden needs tending. Chickens need looking after, mending to be done. Nothing you wouldn't have done in your own home, I expect. And that's all you expect? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Martha suddenly became very interested in clearing the dishes. Victor met Sarah's eyes steadily. Mrs. Parker, I meant what I said. I made a promise to Thomas, and I aim to keep it. You have a roof over your head and protection in my name, but I expect nothing from you that would compromise your dignity or virtue. Sarah studied him, searching for deception but finding none. Thank you, she finally said, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. That night, lying in an actual bed for the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself to weep quietly. For Thomas, for her lost dreams, and for the uncertainty that still lay ahead. But there was a small comfort in knowing that, for tonight at least, she was safe. The following weeks brought routine to Sarah's life. She rose early, helped Martha with breakfast, then tended to the chickens and vegetable garden while Victor and his two ranch hands, Hank and Benjamin, worked with the cattle. Parker, he called, striding toward her. We've got trouble coming. Cattle rustlers hit the Johnsons' place 10 miles east. Word is they're moving west. What does that mean for us? Sarah asked, clutching the basket of eggs. It means we need to move the herd to the north pasture tonight. I've sent Hank to town for help. He ran a hand through his hair. I need you and Martha to keep the house secure. There's a shotgun in my bedroom. Do you know how to use it? Sarah nodded. Thomas had taught her to shoot shortly after they'd married. That night, Sarah sat by the window, shotgun across her lap, watching for any sign of trouble. Victor had left with Benjamin hours ago to move the cattle. Martha dozed in a chair by the fire. A flicker of movement caught Sarah's eyeshadows moving near the barn. Setting the shotgun ready, she peered into the darkness. 3 men were approaching the house. Martha, she whispered urgently. Someone's coming. Martha was instantly alert, moving to extinguish the lamps. Could be Victor returning, she whispered hopefully. No, he would have called out. Sarah positioned herself by the window, raising the shotgun. Stay back. The men were at the porch now, speaking in low voices. Sarah could make out their plans to rob the house, thinking it empty with the men gone to protect the cattle. When the first man tried the door handle, Sarah fired a warning shot into the ceiling of the porch. The next one won't miss, she shouted. This property is defended. Cursing erupted from outside, followed by the sound of retreating footsteps. Moments later, hoofbeats signaled their departure. Sarah remained vigilant until dawn, when Victor returned, looking exhausted but relieved to find the house secure. When Martha told him what had happened, he turned to Sarah with newfound respect. You protected my home, he said simply. Our home, Sarah corrected, then blushed at her own forwardness. I mean, while I'm here. Something shifted in Victor's gaze, then a warmth that hadn't been there before. The attempted robbery changed the dynamic between them. Victor began including Sarah in discussions about the ranch, valuing her opinions and insights. Came west to outrun memories, I suppose. I'm sorry, Sarah said softly. Been 12 years now. He looked at her directly. Thomas wrote to me about you, you know. Said you were the strongest woman he'd ever known. Said if anything happened to him, he hoped you'd find someone worthy of that strength. Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes. He said that. Victor nodded. I didn't come to town looking to buy a woman, Sarah. I came looking for you specifically after I got word about the auction. Couldn't let Thomas's wife be sold to just anyone. Something about his steadfast presence had become a comfort to her, though she scarcely admitted it to herself. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Victor cleared his throat. Mrs. Parker, Sarah, there's something I need to discuss with you. Her heart quickened inexplicably. Yes, the bill of sale. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the paper that had transferred her debt and effectively her person to him. It's been weighing on me. How so? Victor stared into the fire. You're not property, Sarah. Never were. This paper, he held it up. It's an abomination. No person should own another. Before she could respond, he tossed the paper into the flames, where it curled and blackened. You're free, he said simply. Have been since you arrived. I just wanted you to know it official like. You can leave whenever you choose, with my blessing and enough money to start fresh. Sarah watched the paper burn, emotions warring within her. And if I choose to stay? Victor's eyes met hers, surprise evident. Then you stay as a free woman, earning a proper wage for your work here. Just as an employee? The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Victor's expression softened. For now, unless you ever wanted something different. That night, Sarah lay awake, Thomas's face coming to her mind. For the first time, the memory brought more peace than pain. Would he approve of the growing feelings she had for Victor? She believed he would. The winter months brought them closer. Long evenings by the fire with Victor teaching Sarah to play chess. Weekend trips into the nearest town, Jackson, for supplies. Small touches that lingered his hand steadying her as she descended from a wagon, her fingers brushing his as she passed him coffee. The ranch hands noticed. Sarah overheard Hank telling Benjamin. Boss looks at her like a man dying of thirst looks at water. She had pretended not to hear, but the words warmed her through the cold Wyoming nights. It was during a particularly fierce blizzard in January that everything changed. Victor and Hank had gone to check on a vulnerable part of the herd, but when Hank returned alone, his face was etched with worry. Victor's horse spooked at a falling branch, he explained to Sarah. Threw him and bolted. I tried to find him, but the snow's coming down too hard. Lost his tracks. Fear clutched at Sarah's heart. Where? How far from here? East pasture. Maybe 3 miles out. Sarah was already pulling on her heavy coat. I'm going after him. Mrs. Parker, you can't. Martha protested. The storm. We'll kill him if someone doesn't find him, Sarah finished firmly. Hank, I need the strongest horse we have. Despite their protests, Sarah set out into the blinding snow, a lantern held high. It'll be touch and go, the doctor warned Sarah privately. Keep him warm. Try to get broth into him when he's conscious. For a week, Sarah barely left Victor's side, sponging his fever-hot skin, coaxing sips of broth between cracked lips, reading aloud from his favorite books. She spoke to him even when he couldn't respond, telling him about her life with Thomas, her childhood in Ohio, her dreams that had never died despite everything. And sometimes, when exhaustion overtook her vigilance, she whispered things she'd never dared say aloud, how his quiet strength had become her anchor, how his respect had restored her faith, how the thought of losing him had revealed feelings she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. On the 8th night, when his fever finally broke, Victor opened clear eyes to find Sarah asleep in a chair beside his bed, her hand resting on his. Without waking her, he gently interlaced his fingers with hers. Recovery was slow. February turned to March as Victor gradually regained his strength, moving from bed to chair to short walks leaning on a crutch. Sarah was his constant companion, and in the enforced intimacy of his convalescence, the last barriers between them began to fall. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Victor turned to her. When I was lost in that storm, I made peace with dying, he admitted. But I had one regret. What was that? Sarah asked softly. That I'd never told you how I feel. He reached for her hand. I know it might be too soon after Thomas. It's been nearly a year, Sarah interrupted gently. Thomas would want me to be happy. Are you happy here? I mean, Sarah looked out across the ranch, at the land that had become home, then back to the man beside her. I am. More than I thought possible after everything. Victor's hand tightened around hers. I love you, Sarah Parker. Not because of a promise to Thomas, but because of who you are. Your strength, your kindness, your courage. He paused, suddenly uncertain. I don't expect you to feel the same. Sarah leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, silencing his doubts. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as months of unspoken feelings found expression. When they finally parted, Victor's eyes were wide with wonder. I take it that means you might feel something similar? He asked, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It means I love you too, Victor Daniels, Sarah replied, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Though heaven knows you're a stubborn man. Stubborn enough to ask you to marry me? His expression grew serious. He had loved her enough to ensure she'd be cared for, never imagining she would find love again with the man he'd trusted. That night, as they stood in the bedroom that was now theirs to share, Victor took her hands. I want you to know something, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll spend every day trying to be the man Thomas wanted you to have, someone who respects your strength, who partners with you rather than owns you, who loves you fully. Sarah reached up to touch his face. You already are that man, Victor, and I am exactly where I'm meant to be. Broken Arrow Ranch expanded accordingly, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Sarah never forgot where she'd come from, the auction block where her life had seemed to end, only to find a new beginning. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and Victor sat beside her on the porch, she would remind him, You bought a woman in despair and found a partner instead, she'd say, squeezing his hand. And Victor would always reply, No, love, I kept a promise to a friend and found my heart instead. In the spring of 1886, exactly 10 years after Sarah had stood trembling on that auction block, a letter arrived from a lawyer in Denver. Thomas Parker's cousin had died, revealing in his will that he had cheated Thomas in a business deal years ago. The restitution, with interest, amounted to a considerable sum of money that rightfully belonged to Sarah as Thomas's widow. Victor brought the letter to her as she sat in the garden, watching their children play. It seems Thomas is still looking out for you, he said, handing her the envelope. Sarah read the letter twice, tears forming. For us, she corrected gently. He's looking out for us. They used the money to build a schoolhouse in Jackson, ensuring their children and those of neighboring ranches would have education close to home. The plaque beside the door read simply, The Parker Daniels School, founded on promises kept. Their life wasn't without hardships, drought years that threatened the cattle, a fire that nearly claimed the barn, the winter when all 4 children fell ill with scarlet fever. But they weathered each storm together, their partnership only strengthening with each challenge overcome. By 1896, 20 years after they'd met, Broken Arrow Ranch had become a landmark in the county. Their eldest son, Samuel, now 18, worked alongside Victor, learning every aspect of ranching. Eleanor, their spirited 16-year-old daughter, had her heart set on attending university in Denver, a dream her parents fully supported. The 14-year-old twins were inseparable troublemakers with hearts of gold, already showing talent for breaking horses. When Sarah clicked it open, she found a miniature copy of their wedding portrait on one side. On the other was engraved, From auction block to beloved, every step worth taking. Victor, she breathed, tears welling. It's beautiful. Not as beautiful as you, he replied, taking her hand. At 62, his face was lined with years of sun and laughter, but his eyes still held the same clear honesty that had first earned her trust. 20 years ago, I promised to be the man Thomas wanted you to have. I've tried my best to honor that. You've been more, Sarah said, leaning against his shoulder as they gazed out over their land. You've been the man I needed, the father our children deserved, the partner I never dared dream of finding. Below them, Broken Arrow Ranch spread out in the late afternoon sun. The house expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family. The barn rebuilt after the fire, larger and stronger than before, the corrals full of horses, the pastures dotted with cattle. In the distance, the spire of the schoolhouse they'd built was just visible, a legacy that would outlast them both. Do you ever wonder, Victor asked quietly, what would have happened if I hadn't come to town that day? If someone else had bought your contract? Sarah shook her head. I believe Thomas was watching over me. He knew what kind of man you were. She squeezed his hand. And I believe Eleanor was too. She guided you to me when we both needed healing. Victor nodded, emotion making it difficult to speak. Finally, he managed, I think you're right. Somehow, we were meant to find each other. As the sun began to set, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared history a precious burden. From the valley came the distant sound of their sons calling the cattle home. The ring of the dinner bell Martha still insisted on using despite her advancing years, the bark of the dogs heralding visitors, likely their daughter returning from her friend's home in Jackson. We should head back, Sarah said eventually, though neither made a move to rise. In a minute, Victor replied, his arm tightening around her. Let's just watch the sun set on another day we were blessed to share. Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, the locket warm in her palm. From auction block to beloved the journey had not been easy, but every step, every struggle, every joy had led her here, to this moment of perfect contentment. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they finally gathered their things and mounted their horses for the ride home. The lights of the ranch glowed warm and welcoming in the valley below, a beacon guiding them back to the life they'd built together. Race you home? Victor challenged with a boyish grin. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the hillside. You're on, Cowboy. And together they rode toward the lights, toward their children, toward the home that had grown from a promise kept to a love freely given, a love that had transformed them both from broken souls to a family stronger than either could have imagined on that fateful day in Dry Creek, 20 years before. The years continued to flow, bringing changes both expected and surprising. Their children grew into adults any parent would be proud of. Samuel married the daughter of a neighboring rancher, combining their lands and expanding the Daniels legacy. Eleanor did attend university in Denver, returning as the first female doctor in Jackson, a position that raised eyebrows but saved countless lives. The twins, James and Joseph, took different paths, James becoming a skilled horse trainer whose reputation spread throughout the territory, while Joseph discovered a talent for law and became a respected attorney in Cheyenne. By 1906, Victor and Sarah were grandparents 7 times over, each child bringing new joy into their lives. The ranch remained the heart of family gatherings, with bedrooms filling with laughter and running feet whenever holidays brought everyone home. That spring, as they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary, Sarah found Victor in Thomas's old study, the one room in the house that remained largely unchanged over the decades. He was holding a faded letter, its creases well worn from frequent handling. Thomas's last letter? Sarah asked softly, recognizing it. Victor nodded. I was just thinking about how different life might have been. He carefully refolded the paper. He wrote that you deserved happiness, that he couldn't bear the thought of leaving you unprotected in a hard world. Sarah crossed the room and placed her hand on Victor's cheek, now lined with age but still as dear to her as ever. He would be pleased with how you kept your word. I think he'd be prouder of you, Victor replied, covering her hand with his own. The frightened widow on that auction block became the backbone of this family, this ranch, this community. We did it together, Sarah corrected gently. Partners, remember? That summer brought record heat and drought to Wyoming. The ranch hands worked tirelessly to keep the cattle watered, digging deeper wells and rationing supplies. Victor, despite Sarah's concerns about his age, insisted on working alongside them. It was during one such scorching day in August that he collapsed, the years and the punishing sun finally taking their toll. Sarah found him being carried to the house by Samuel and Hank, his face ashen. The next weeks were hauntingly familiar to Sarah, the doctor's grave expressions, the cooling cloths, the whispered prayers. But unlike the young man who had fought back from pneumonia decades before, Victor's 72-year-old body struggled to recover from the heat stroke that had damaged his heart. On a surprisingly cool evening in September, as a rare rain blessed the parched land, Victor called Sarah to his bedside. His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear and present. "Sarah," he said, taking her hand, "I need to say something while I still can." "Save your strength," she pleaded, though she recognized the look in his eyes, the same peaceful acceptance she'd seen in Thomas's face at the end. "No need," he replied with a small smile. "I've said most everything worth saying over these 30 years. But I want you to know," his voice caught, then steadied. "You were never just a promise I kept. You were the greatest blessing of my life." Sarah bent to kiss his forehead, her tears falling onto his cheeks. "As you were mine, we saved each other, Victor." "Promise me something?" he asked, his breath growing labored. "Anything. Live fully. Don't retreat into mourning. The ranch needs you. Our family needs you." Sarah nodded, unable to speak through her tears. "And when it's your time," he continued, squeezing her hand with surprising strength, "I'll be waiting, along with Thomas. Reckon he'd like to hear how I did with his final request." Despite her grief, Sarah smiled at the image. "I think you exceeded his expectations." Victor's eyes drifted closed. "I love you, Sarah Daniels. From auction block to eternity." "I love you too, my cowboy," she whispered. Victor Daniels passed peacefully in his sleep that night, with Sarah holding his hand and their children gathered around the bed. Outside, the gentle rain continued, bringing renewal to the drought-stricken land, a final gift. The funeral was the largest Jackson had ever seen. Ranchers, townspeople, and even the governor of Wyoming came to pay respects to the man who had built not just a successful ranch, but a legacy of integrity and compassion. Sarah stood straight-backed beside her children as they laid Victor to rest beneath the cottonwood tree on the hilltop where they had spent so many anniversaries. Though her heart was breaking, she felt his strength flowing through her, reminding her of her promise. In the months that followed, Sarah surprised everyone but those who knew her best. Rather than retiring to a quieter life, she took a more active role in ranch operations, partnering with Samuel to implement new breeding techniques and more efficient water management systems. She became a force in local politics, advocating for women's suffrage in Wyoming, already a pioneer state in women's rights, to be extended nationally. On the anniversary of Victor's death, Sarah rode alone to the cottonwood tree. As she sat beside his grave, she told him about the year the new grandchild born to Eleanor, the award James had won for his horse breeding program, the case Joseph had argued before the Territorial Supreme Court. "You would be so proud of them, Victor," she said, running her hand over the carved headstone. "Of the family we created, of the legacy we built together." As she spoke, her fingers found the locket she still wore every day. Opening it, she traced the faded wedding portrait and the inscription that had become her life's journey. From auction block to beloved. The sun was setting as Sarah mounted her horse for the ride home, casting long shadows across the hillside. Below, lights were beginning to glow in the windows of Broken Arrow Ranch, where her family waited. Her eldest granddaughter, Victoria, named for the grandfather she resembled in spirit and determination, would be waiting on the porch, eager to hear stories of the ranch's early days. Sarah took one last look at the grave beneath the cottonwood tree. "Until we meet again, my love," she whispered, then turned her horse toward home. As she rode down the hillside, Sarah reflected on the strange and beautiful path her life had taken. From a desperate widow on an auction block to the matriarch of a thriving dynasty. From property to be sold to a woman respected throughout the territory. From grief-stricken hopelessness to a life so full of love it sometimes seemed her heart might burst with it. All because a cowboy had kept a promise to a dying friend. All because Victor Daniels had said 7 simple words that changed everything. "I'll be the man he wanted you to have." And in being that man, honorable, respectful, loving Victor had helped Sarah become more fully herself. Together, they had transformed a business arrangement born of desperation into a partnership that had enriched not just their own lives, but those of countless others. As the lights of home grew closer, Sarah straightened in her saddle, feeling the familiar ache in bones that had weathered 72 Wyoming winters. There would be more winters to come, more springs, more summers and autumns, each one a gift to be lived fully, as she had promised Victor. The ranch dogs ran out to greet her, followed by Victoria, her 15-year-old face alight with the same determination that had characterized both her namesake and Sarah herself. "Grandmother," the girl called, "you're just in time. Uncle Joseph has arrived from Cheyenne with news." Sarah dismounted, her movements slower than in years past but still confident. "Good news, I hope?" Victoria's grin widened. "The best. Congress is considering a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. Uncle Joseph says your testimony before the committee made a difference." Sarah felt a surge of pride and satisfaction. Another battle in the long war for justice, one she had joined late in life but embraced with the same passion she brought to everything. As she walked toward the house with Victoria's arm linked through hers, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement near the cottonwood tree on the distant hill, a tall figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. For a moment, her heart stopped, then resumed with a knowing beat. Some promises extended beyond the grave. Some love stories never truly ended. "Are you all right, grandmother?" Victoria asked, noticing her pause. Sarah smiled, squeezing her granddaughter's arm. "More than all right, dear one. I was just remembering something your grandfather once told me." "What was that?" Sarah looked back at the hill, but the figure was gone, faded like the last rays of sunset. Yet the warmth of its presence lingered, wrapping around her like a familiar embrace. That love, true love, is the greatest freedom of all. And with that, Sarah Parker Daniels walked into the home she had built with Victor, surrounded by the family they had created, carrying forward the legacy that had begun with a desperate auction and a cowboy's promise, a legacy of dignity restored, of partnership honored, of love transcending both time and circumstance. A legacy that had transformed her journey from auction block to beloved into a story that would be told for generations to come.